I have the great pleasure of introducing two panels, both of which I was excited to attend. So it was easy to say yes to being the chair. Eric Gardner from the Getty is going to talk about future-proofing digital publications. And he'll go for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little discussion. And then we'll turn over to Sarah Wombold and Marty Spellerberg, who are going to talk about WordPress and also content architecture and content strategy. And there's a lot of interesting overlap between the two.
Thanks, Amy. So my name's Eric Gardner. I work in digital publications with Greg Albers at the Getty. I've been there for not quite a year, and I'm here to talk about building future-proof digital publications. So the title of this talk is "The Future is Static," because I think that in digital publishing it very well might be. And we're going to be jumping around a lot between 2015 and the 1980s, so I thought this was an appropriate theme. So let me start out by talking about the problem. Do a lot of people in here work in digital publishing? I assume that that's why you're here. So how many of you lie awake at night wondering if the projects that you've worked on for months and months or years even will still be accessible in like 5 years? Does that worry anybody? I'm going to talk a lot about that. So as museum technologists, we occupy an uncomfortable intersection between two very different time frames. The pace of technology changes very rapidly, while scholarship, in comparison, advances at what you might consider a glacial pace. It takes years or even decades for scholarly work to mature often and to get cited and transmitted, et cetera. So this contradiction is even sharper when you talk about museums in particular, where cultural heritage is concerned, because then you're talking about things that really should remain accessible forever, for the foreseeable future. So again, do you worry that what you're doing will become inaccessible 10 or even 5 years from now? I think that's a big problem. Another way of saying this, of course, is the future becomes the past much more quickly than we expect it to. Case in point. This is a great movie, Back to the Future Part 2, but it's now a work of historical fiction. They travel into the future, which is actually about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, things change quickly. So when was the last time that anyone here has used a 20-year-old piece of software? Can you think of anything? What was it, out of curiosity? Text editor, yeah. That's about probably the only thing that will last that long, right? What about 10-year-old piece of software? 5-year-old piece of software? Yeah, you want to throw out what you got? Yeah, I guess that counts. But it's still, it changes. They release a new version constantly, right? So even these things are constantly changing. I'm sure it's the same for most of the other things that have lasted. So things move quickly, and things become obsolete really fast. So I have a little cautionary tale. Have you ever heard of the Domesday Project? Maybe some of you have. So this is a really interesting example of this problem from before the internet, essentially. So the problem goes way back. So in 1986, to commemorate the 900-year anniversary of this thing called the Domesday Book, which is this very important historical document from medieval England, where William the Conqueror wanted a survey of his new domain, basically. They commissioned this big book that documented all this amazing information about daily life in England in the year 986 AD. I think it was called the Domesday Book because they thought maybe Doomsday was around the corner, year 1000 or something. Anyway, to commemorate this 900 years later, the BBC, some very cutting edge tech forward people in the BBC said, we're going to create a new version of the Domesday Book. It's going to be this multimedia digital experience. It's going to be awesome. And so it was really ahead of its time. They mobilized thousands of people all over England. They broke up the entire country into these things called D blocks, where it was essentially like citizen science, crowdsourced content. People were going around interviewing, writing up content about like their own neighborhoods, the history of their own sort of little cultural groups, and it was all being compiled into this massive project to be this amazing multimedia snapshot of England, of a country in a particular moment in time. So it was built using cutting-edge technology to contain all this multimedia information back in the 80s. You needed this gigantic double-sided laser disc, these specially built computers. This was before the mouse was standardized, so it had this special trackpad interface. On the previous screen, there was like a 3D art gallery that you could. This is when most people were using things like DOS. So this, again, it was really ahead of its time. Cutting-edge stuff. A lot of time and money was spent on this project. Can you guess what happened? Not 15 years later, this is a story in I think it was in The Observer, now it's The Guardian. it was in danger of becoming almost totally inaccessible because the format, they were making this project before formats for how do you share things like photos and videos. These weren't even standardized yet. Like the JPEG didn't exist in 1986. So it was really in danger of just disappearing entirely, which is kind of a terrifying thing to contemplate. That so much time and energy went into this, and in such a really infinitesimal amount of time later, it's almost gone. So due to the heroic efforts of some programmers associated with the BBC, this project has sort of been revived. I have a link to how it lives on at the end of my presentation. But this is a cautionary tale, basically. So how do we avoid creating another obsolete future in the work that we do? We want to create immersive experiences. We want to be on the cutting edge, just like those guys did. But every time that you do that, you're kind of making a wager. When you're using cutting edge technology, there's no guarantee that it's still going to be cutting edge or even standardized or even widely used a few years down the road. So you're kind of taking a bet. So how do we avoid creating obsolete futures like this one, right? I'm still waiting for my hoverboard. So the solution, of course, is time travel. So we're going to go back to the year 1989 and talk about another set of technologies and how they've fared since then. Of course, I'm going to talk about the World Wide Web, which was sort of founded in 1989. It was created by this guy, Tim Berners-Lee. And what it was is actually it was designed as a scholarly publishing platform. So the web originated as a digital publishing platform to serve the needs of CERN, the particle accelerator in Switzerland. The researchers were producing vast amounts of data, and they didn't have a good way to share what they were doing as they were creating these advances in science. So what Berners-Lee did, there were a lot of existing technologies, and he just had this idea to kind of bring them all together. Hypertext, the internet, the personal computer. He provided a simple way for these things to work together, and it's exploded, and it's become the web, and it's sort of devoured almost every other aspect of our lives in the decades since. Amazingly, the first web page still works. So I'll show you real quick here, sorry. This is it. Oh, wait. Speaking of technology, it's real quick. This is the first web page from CERN. It's sort of the info page for the project. All of this is totally untouched, so it's info.cern.ch. So just of course, it's hardly a hoverboard. It's not the most advanced thing, but the content is still there. And so I think I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so does this mean that in order to make things that are accessible for the long term that we have to party like it's 1989? I mean, that's a pretty profound limitation, right? A lot has changed since the days of the early web. We've moved from the original idea of this interlinked collection of documents, the original idea, these interlinked research papers, but now then they became websites, with navigation and widgets, and it's doing all this kind of stuff. And then those have increasingly become apps, things that it's less about content, it's more about what you're doing, It's not just a place to go, it's a place to do. So today's web can drive you somewhere, it can take you shopping, it can deliver your groceries, it can find your life partner. This is a much taller order than the original web as it was first envisioned. So the problem still remains. How do we, using the latest standards of technology, how do we build things, specifically publications, that are going to be around as long as they should be? So kind of a restatement of the problem. Our tools have become a lot more complex, but they've a lot more powerful, but they've also become tremendously more complex. And this complexity, when not carefully managed, it's going to ensure that our projects have a really short shelf life. I think as a developer, complexity is the enemy. A lot of programming, software development practices are really about the management of complexity, and I think that we can apply some of that thinking here. So one little side note, I want to talk about publishing digitally in general, but I'm specifically concerned with the web, publishing on the web. There are lots of different technologies available to us now, but I think as a publisher, we want things to reach the widest audience possible. And so I think that the web has to be a part of that solution. To just limit yourself entirely to sort of the walled gardens, it's a mistake, in my opinion. So what I'm saying is about the web specifically, but I think it applies to a lot of technology generally. So I'm going to talk for a second about the structure of a modern website. We're talking about complexity. Why is it so hard to make something now that will last for a long time? Well, there's actually a lot going on under the hood. The typical website from 2010 is actually a pretty complicated piece of machinery. So there's a data layer. Often this lives in a relational database using a protocol like SQL. There's an application layer, which is usually a CMS, probably written in PHP, something like Drupal or WordPress. There are many others. It's running 24/7. So this is the engine. It's constantly running. It's responding to requests. And then it's assembling content on the fly, which is then delivered to the client. And so every web page is unique, actually, is kind of a special snowflake. And then the client layer is assembled together out of these partial templates with the data from the database, and that's where you get HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And this is actually a pretty simple example. I'm not even going to get into like caching, distributed nodes for content delivery, etc. But that all happens in the real world. In this setup, there's really only one part of it that's easily human readable, and that's what you get on the client side. Without the client tying it together, it might be very hard to actually get at, well, gee, we put this data into the database, but what does it actually look like unless we're seeing it through the lens of the client as these things are being rendered? So that's, I think, a longevity problem right there, potentially, right? If one part of the system goes down, you can't necessarily salvage the content from the others. So in some circles, the architecture I just showed is already considered totally obsolete 5 years later. So in 2015, increasingly a lot of web applications, they have multiple data sources. There's the traditional relational databases from before, but there might be lots of them talking to each other. There are totally different database protocols at work, like NoSQL, things like that, document databases instead of relational databases. They're pulling data from other sources in the cloud. It's distributed all over the place, APIs, etc. Instead of a monolithic application like earlier, it's being broken up into a network of microservices. So now the work is being done across different platforms. It's distributed across multiple locations, multiple programming languages, different pieces of hardware, etc. And the single experience has given way to a proliferation of different experiences where you've got all these different devices you need to serve, different platforms. They all have their own needs that need to be met. So we've got responsive design, the Internet of Things, native applications, etc. And actually on the client side, this is where things have gotten the most complex, because sometimes this is where a second application is built that lives entirely in JavaScript that pulls in information from further left in the diagram here. So maybe you don't even have one place for your application. Maybe you have both a server-side application powering your API and a client-side application that's controlling the information on someone's device. So we've just gotten a lot more complex. So we're kind of building this thing, right? This is the flux capacitor, which breaks down and leaves you stranded when you least expect it. So so this gives way to what I call the complexity blues. So again, these dynamic web applications are capable of amazing things. They can deliver an incredible experience to users. But keeping the machinery running is a real task in and of itself, and it often requires a dedicated team of specialists. So once created, each product really becomes a process. It's got to be fed, watered, actively maintained. Does this sound familiar? Right? So you can't just set it and forget it. And from the perspective of being a publisher, this is really problematic, because when you're publishing books, you publish a book and it's done. It's out in the world. And then you have your same team and they can focus on publishing the next book. In this model, if your books are web applications, then you need an ever-increasing staff to manage these things as it expands, right? So how does that not grind the entire process of publishing to a screeching halt? Another way of saying this, do publishers need to turn into software developers in order to survive the 21st century? I've been talking a lot about the future. This probably sounds like a kind of dystopian future to some people in this room, right? This is a totally different reallocation of resources. And so again, I think that modern web technology is amazing. For many scenarios, it's exactly what you need. But from the perspective of academic and cultural institutions that are publishing and often operating on shoestring, not-for-profit budgets, a lot of these features for these modern applications, they might actually look more like bugs. So here's a game. feature or bug? I'm going to talk about some of the things that we have access to now, and you guys can tell me if you think it's a feature or a bug. So from the perspective of publication specifically. So dynamic, real-time updates up to the minute. Is this a feature or is this a bug? What about a platform where non-technical users can easily create or edit content? Is that a feature or is that a bug? That's probably a feature. What about the ability to handle thousands or millions of active logged-in users? Again, I guess it depends on what you're doing, right? Ability to show all those users different things, tracking their activity, anticipating their requests, things like that. I think that a lot of these are not really features as far as we're concerned. I think this is the feature, essentially, and that from the perspective of publishing, digital publishing, a lot of these other things might be considered bugs. And this is not to say this is true in all cases, but I think this is true in many cases. So what if I told you you don't need any of this stuff to create a website? There is another way, and I think for some projects this way might be a great fit for many people here. So I want to talk about static site generators. This is a technology that it's been around for a while, but I think it's seen a lot more adoption recently. I'll get into a lot more detail, but the idea is plain text files kind of fill the role of a database. Then you run a command line program instead of a application on a server, and it spits out HTML files. So text goes in, you run a process, and then static files come out. So this became popular among developers who wanted a simple and cheap way to host personal websites and blogs. One of the first was Jekyll, which was created by Tom Preston Werner, who is one of the founders of GitHub. Now there are many others. Virtually all of them are open source. The reason Jekyll is called Jekyll is because it's a transformation engine, essentially. So the architecture, compare this to before, the data layer, instead of a database or something that's much more complicated, it's just text files, a folder full of text files, often written in something like Markdown, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but human readable text files. The application layer, it's still there, but it's not running live on the server 24/7. It's probably on the developer's computer. It's run from the command line. It takes the input, spits out output, and then the output are web pages. So static, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is the presentation layer. These are some examples of popular static site generators. Jekyll was the first one I learned. It kind of blew my mind. And then Middleman is something that's maybe a little bit more customizable. And so we're using that as the basis for what we're doing in Getty publications right now. Both of these are written in Ruby. There are many, many more written in lots of different languages. This website is a directory full of them. So if you're interested, take a look. You could probably find something in a language that you're already familiar with. There are a lot of advantages of working this way, in my opinion. So first, I want to talk about the advantage on the data side of maybe abandoning a database if you don't need one and keeping your data in a plain text format. This data will remain accessible for the foreseeable future in a human readable format because it's just plain text, and that's probably not going to go away. Formats like Markdown, which I will go into more detail in later, they allow authors to focus on the semantic meaning of what they're doing rather than the presentation. Programs like Microsoft Word, they really hold your hand, like, what font do you want for this text? Do you want it to be this big or that big? These are things that, again, from the perspective of, a lot of academic writing, it's a distraction because some other designer is going to design it. What the editors and the writers should be thinking about is the semantic meaning of what they're doing. Is this a heading, a subheading, whatever? So it's a lot easier to focus on the content rather than the presentation in this format. And finally, software developers have a lot of really powerful tools for working with plain text. One of the most important is Git for version control. There are many others, regular expressions, things like that. So working in a plain text format gives you access to this whole other universe of very powerful tools. The static build system also has a lot of advantages. So there's nothing running on a server. It's just static files. This means there's nothing to secure. The best security is have nothing to hack. So there's no security updates. There's no patches. There are no vulnerabilities. If you're running a content management system, that application, it's live on the server constantly, and it's constantly listening for someone to tell it to do something. And you need security is making sure only the right instructions go in. But this program, it's not listening when you're not using it. It's only there when you need it. So there's no vulnerability. Performance often is a huge, you get a huge boost in performance from working this way because nothing is faster than just static HTML files. You're not making database calls. Things aren't being assembled on the fly. They're already there, ready to go. Web servers are really good at serving static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript very quickly. And I think the biggest advantage is you can set it and forget it. You don't have to keep sort of feeding the beast. It's there, it's done. If you want to change it, like make a new edition, you certainly can. And lastly, sorry. To say something is static is not to say that it's not interactive. A lot of advances have been made on the client side of the web browsers in the last couple of years. And so you can have all kinds of amazing interactivity that doesn't actually require a live server. You can do this on the client side in JavaScript. This totally is compatible with this approach. So users might not have any idea that they're on a static site if you do things right, I think. And it shouldn't matter to them. It's a detail that's not relevant to them. So the key technologies that I'm going to talk about here that make this possible in the world of static site generators, there's Markdown, which is a format for writing text. There's YAML, which is a text format for data. And then there's Git and GitHub for version control. So I'll talk about each one. So Markdown. This is Markdown. I think even if some of you have never seen it before, it's probably pretty obvious what's going on, or will be in a second. So Markdown is a plain text format where you can indicate through a very basic syntax that involves pound characters, underscores, asterisks, things like that, whether something is a list, whether it's a heading, basically all the basic HTML tags. You don't need a complicated markup format to do that. It's just text. You can even support footnotes in many implementations of Markdown. There are some nice editing interfaces for Markdown if you don't want to write in a plain text fashion, but you're still the files are still plain text, but there are some programs that will allow you to actually control like heading 1, heading 2, bold, italics, where again, the end user doesn't have to really need to be thinking about it so much. They can just be hitting the formatting buttons the same they would in a WYSIWYG editor, but the output is plain text. So Markdown was created by John Gruber. He runs the blog Daring Fireball, so some of you may have heard of him, but he created Markdown years ago. And the idea was, his quote here, "The overriding design goal for Markdown's formatting syntax is to make it as readable as possible. The idea is that a Markdown formatted document should be publishable as is, as plain text, without looking like it's been marked up with tags or formatting instructions." I think that's really awesome, and I think that's a really powerful design decision. So there's more information. This is a link to the page where the original specification for Markdown. In the links at the end of this talk, I've got the guide that GitHub has for Markdown. So there's a lot more information about that. But it's very simple, and it's simple and powerful. Next, I'll talk about YAML. YAML stands for YAML Ain't a Markup Language in true recursive acronym fashion. So Jekyll, which was one of the first static site generators that was widely used, the brilliant idea about it, one of the really brilliant ideas, was to combine Markdown, which lets you describe the content, with YAML, which lets you describe the metadata, both of which can exist together in a plain text file in a very simple way. So this is what's called front matter. In between these dashes is YAML, and then this is the text. So what goes in between those dashes is totally arbitrary. It's totally up to you. YAML is very good for storing things like a key value format. So it's directly translatable into something like JSON, but also JavaScript or Ruby objects. It's just a way to hold metadata. And the syntax is very elegant. You don't have quotations and semicolons and things like that everywhere, but it will be translated and parsed, and all that stuff will make sense to the machine. So this allows you to define the metadata about what you're writing as you're writing it without this complicated additional step. So Markdown and YAML work together great for simple articles, but you can also use YAML to represent way more complex forms of data. This is an example from one of the online catalogs we're working on, where we have a series of objects. They're artifacts, they're sculptures from ancient Italy. They have a lot of attributes. This is, again, it's sort of analogous to a JSON blob, where we've defined internally an API for how these objects are going to be represented in the context of this catalog. And then it's just a text file. So there's an info section with its ID in the Getty's cataloging system, its dimensions, where it came from, Then there's text content, its description, etc. Again, just like what you'd see in like the JSON response from a collection API, you can recreate all of this in YAML, and it's just a text file. So finally, Git and GitHub for version control. How many people here have heard of Git? Okay, has anyone worked with Git or GitHub? Okay, so a lot of you. So I won't spend too much time on it, but the idea is, it's a distributed system for version control. It was developed by Linus Torvalds, who also created Linux, for collaborative software editing. It works by watching a folder full of files, which is known as a repository. Once you initialize a repository, Git will track the commits, the changes to a series of files, and it's distributed. So each collaborator has a complete copy of the repository at all points in its history. Again, you can, to kind of keep with the thinking of the theme of this talk, you can think of Git as a time travel device. It allows you to move backward and forward in a project's history, and also to save, in the event of a disaster, you can recover things very quickly. Another thing that's great about Git and GitHub is you can do many of the same things that you maybe used to do in Word. So if you ditch your Word files and now you're working in a plain text format, whoa, where's my track changes? Editors are really reliant on features like this. Well, you can recreate a lot of this within Git itself. So the highlighting is kind of hard to see here, but you've got green and red bars that indicate the changes in a particular text file. So working in plain text and initializing a Git repository allows you to track line by line the changes to the text as people edit it. And this works with multiple collaborators as well as it works with one collaborator. So it's a very powerful feature. Of course, it's a little complicated. I won't lie. I think we've all had our moments of Git frustration. I thought this was a funny comic. But anyway, it's very easy to learn. There's another link at the end of this talk that gives a good tutorial. It's an interactive online tutorial for learning Git. It's try.github.io. I think Code School made it. So if you're confused and you feel like these people, I'd suggest starting with that. So now I'm going to talk specifically about how these things come together at the Getty. Our static publishing workflow, which it's still a work in progress, but this is what we're doing right now, is we are converting the author's texts once the text is basically done. They still work in Word, and then we're converting that into Markdown, and then we're coming up with data in YAML, which the data side of the collection or whatever we're publishing. We're doing a collection catalog as our main project now, so data often means object data. Then these things go into GitHub for collaborative editing, and the ultimate goal is one source of content, which is human readable and should last for the long term, produces all the other output formats without anything having to be redone. So for the web, EPUB, PDF, print on demand. So the tool or series of tools that we're creating to tie all these things together, we're calling Octavo. So an Octavo, it's a printer's term from the Renaissance for a small portable format of book, popularized by Aldus Manutius. He was reprinting a lot of the classics, like classic Greek and Roman texts in Venice in the 1500s. So for us, it's going to be a set of open source tools to facilitate digital publishing in multiple formats based on static site generation. So the idea, again, in both cases, portability, ease of use, et cetera. And we'll release, sometime next year, we'll release a package of these things all kind of tied together. But this presentation would be incomplete without some demo time, so I thought I would take a minute to show you guys what we're doing right now. How am I on time, by the way?
We're just at time.
Just at 20 minutes?
No, we're at
30?
half hour.
Okay, shoot. Well, I'll show you guys a demo at some point. Come find me later. We can show you what we're doing. So, because it's working now, we have something that we're about to publish in sort of beta version. Further reading, I'll publish these slides. We'll figure out how to do that on all of these topics. And thanks to the people I shamelessly grabbed content from. So yeah, I'd love to chat with folks afterwards when available, and I'm happy to show people what we're doing when we have a little more time. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, so we're going to roll right into Sarah and Marty's discussion of WordPress content architecture and strategy. And then there'll be some time at the end for questions, and there may be some overlap here between these two themes.
You're gonna reach? I don't know if we will reach. Yeah, cool. Well,
If you go over here, yeah. There you go. Is this thing? on?
I don't know.
I think it is. What? Yeah, I just have to get close. Yeah, I'm pretty loud, actually.
That one?
Yes, this one's on.
Should we share it?
We should share it. I probably don't even need it.
Hi, everyone. We talk about WordPress in the museum context. Sarah and I have done a number of projects with it, and we hope we can answer any questions that you might have about it. My experience with WordPress goes back to about '06, when I first used it for a artist website to do a blog, as it was for a news section. A couple of years later, I was at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we had another CMS running the main website and WordPress running our blog. And I found myself more and more using the WordPress installation to solve the problems that came to me. And when I began working with the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, I suggested, I said, well, hey, what if we did the whole thing in WordPress? And I was talking with Nina Simon, and she comes from a blogging background, and she says, sure, I know WordPress, I can use that. And so that's what we used. Soon after, I joined the team at the MCA Chicago and met Sarah.
Shall I take it over?
Sure.
I have to say, I just had this visual of the Saturday Night Live skit with the two NPR people. I feel like we're going to start about sweaty balls. So my name's Sarah Wombold, and I'm the Director of Digital Media at the Clifford Still Museum, which is in Denver, Colorado. I just started that position about a month ago, so it's fresh. And prior to that, I was working as a consultant. I've been working as a digital media consultant for about the past 2 years. But my story actually starts at about 10 years ago at the MCA Chicago. That's where I started working in museums. And I had worked there for a few years, and in about 2009 or 2010, I found myself with the title of multimedia manager, which, speaking of obsolescence, sounds like I've filed CD-ROMs all day. But instead, I actually was establishing the museum's first digital media team, and our very first priority was to tackle their website. At the time that I inherited this site, it was a custom-built CMS that was 5, 6, maybe 8 years old, and we were still using it. So when I started to think about the project of a redesign, I decided to break it down by staged releases. And the first launch was actually a user-facing visual design, which I called the facelift. And I called it the facelift because we didn't go in and address any of the content or architecture issues that we knew we had in the site. But by the time we launched the facelift, our custom-built legacy CMS was held together by duct tape and rubber bands, and enter Marty. So my first conversation with Marty was about the CMS, and that we needed to address the back end as quickly as possible because we were already on borrowed time, but that we would also need to work through the architecture of the site continuously and throughout the project because, well, we know how museums are when you start talking about how you're organizing content and what you're going to label that content. And so let's just say I knew those wheels would be turning for a long time, and we needed to get rid of this MacGyver back end as quickly as possible. So Marty suggested WordPress. And at the time, that seemed pretty crazy to me because I knew it as a blogging platform, and it hadn't really been proven as a reliable system that you could build a robust website on top of. But when he showed me that as the content strategist and not a coder, I could go in and edit and iterate and change the menu and change the structure of the site through the post types and the menu options that I had, I knew that this was the right solution for us. Fast forward from that project about 5 years, and I started working on a website redesign for the Clifford Still Museum. And for this project, we took a really unorthodox approach in terms of the strategy. We actually started the project by replicating the existing icky site on WordPress and released a new content management system with the visuals of the old site on WordPress. From a content strategy point of view, this was brilliant for me because the content migration was already done in the first release. We already delivered on one of the top priorities that was identified by the client, which was a new CMS. And it literally established the foundation. Everything that we built from there on out was built on this already established content management system. And the biggest advantage to this, though, by far, was that it tied the three engines of the project very closely together. So development, design, and content were able to respond together immediately, right? So the designer would suggest a change, we'd code it quickly, we'd see how that design was affecting the content, and vice versa. So we were really able to respond seamlessly to one another, which was advantageous also because time and space. I was in Denver, Marty's in Austin, and the designer we were using was in North Carolina and also Chicago part of that time. So can we look at the menu structure real quick? So when I talk about how I was able to kind of go into the menus and change how the site was functioning, this is exactly what I mean. As part of the process of building the site, we were doing usability testing and open card sorts throughout the process to kind of test our assumptions, and we could immediately see and show our stakeholders the implications of these outcomes. Over to you.
Sure. So I wanted to talk a little bit about doing WordPress sites of this size. It's not the same exactly as what you might do if you were just creating a blog. The themes are from scratch. They're custom built for each project. This is the WordPress theme hierarchy that you would follow to create the templates for the site, and it will get you a lot of what you need. It'll get if you want to show certain kinds of content in certain contexts, this will get you most of the way. However, you will also find yourself wanting to work outside this system, and that's when the WP query comes into play, and it's a very powerful query method for pulling content out of your database and putting it onto the page that you want to put it on. So those are central to the core of WordPress. Then there are a number of plugins that we use on most of the projects. Start with my very, very best friend is called Advanced Custom Fields, and it's a very powerful tool for creating the administration interface, creating the fields that you want for your editors to use. So, for instance, here's that would get into the next thing. So, sorry.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about home pages?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so we wanted to talk for a second about home pages and interrupt me if you have technical stuff to point out.
Sure.
For the MCA's website, because home pages are kind of their special use case. So for the MCA's site, we wanted to prioritize programs and immediacy in terms of surfacing all the programs in chronological order so that they were kind of always there and always visible from the first page. This kind of tied strategically to the MCA's priority at the time which was to foreground the activity as kind of a metaphorical representation of the living artist to kind of distinguish the MCA from the Art Institute of Chicago, which was opening its modern wing around this time. For the Clifford Still Museum's website, I'm trying to talk fast to get to questions, but it's in stark contrast to what happened with the MCA site, where we were very fortunate that the executive director at the Clifford Still had a very clearly articulated vision, which would prioritize the Clifford Still Museum as a destination. Because, after all, when you come to the Clifford Still Museum, what are you going to see? Clifford Stills. When you come back to the Clifford Still Museum, what are you going to see? More Clifford Stills. So we wanted to, we felt that the programming of the institution took a bit of a backseat to showing the physical place to kind of reinforce this idea of the museum as a destination or a point of pilgrimage.
And then I want to show you a preview. This is not quite live for the Santa Cruz MA. It's almost ready, and it's a new our new homepage, mobile first homepage, and the goal of this is to be it's persona driven, very audience driven, and each of the blocks on this page is meant to call out to a particular segment of their audience. And I will show you how we did this. We did a lot of research in determining, so this is the homepage and these are the blocks within it, and we did a lot of research in determining our messaging to these groups. And I wanted to show you that we actually put cues for our content editors right into the CMS so that they could make sure that the messages that they were crafting fit the message that we wanted to be putting out. So that is, and this is all again with advanced custom fields. Advanced custom fields is essential in doing these kinds of sites. I also wanted to show gravity forms, which where advanced custom fields is about doing these very complex fields within the CMS. Gravity forms is a drag and drop form builder. A drag and drop form builder. You've used it. Would you like to describe while I pull it up?
I just thought, we've been working together for a while.
So this is a form on the MCA site that runs the booking of school programs, and there's a lot of conditional programming. You can have fields turn on and off, and you can create your forms just by dragging and dropping. This was actually, Gravity Forms was the reason at the AGO that I really started leaning on WordPress, because prior to this, if somebody wanted a form, they would submit it. It would take us a couple of days to do, and we would create it. With Gravity Forms, they would call me, they would describe it to me on the phone. As they were describing it, I would create the form, and by the end of the conversation, I could have it live on the site. So that was...
And at the Clifford Still, actually, we don't have a webmaster. The staff is so small there. We have about 12 to 15 full-time employees, and they've all been trained on WordPress. And so when education needs a form, education makes a form, which is kind of nice. There's really no bottleneck happening there, which we can do because we have a very small staff.
I wanted to talk a little bit about WordPress security is often a concern. Just mention some best practices. The number one thing is to keep WordPress and your plugins up to date. Sites that get hacked often are ones that had been left to language. It ties into your presentation very well. So WordPress is something that you do maintain actively. Make sure that your WordPress core is up to date. Make sure that your plugin's up to date. Really vet your plugins. There's some very powerful ones out there, but while WordPress core has a huge community evaluating the code and is quite quite secure. A lot of the vulnerabilities are going to come from your plugins. From there, backups. I use a program called Backup Buddy. It creates full site and database only backups, and has been a lifesaver in many situations. Also use Git. It's often I've found malicious code by doing a diff. After backups, there's a plugin called iTheme Security Pro that will do a lot. It'll help you strengthen your passwords. It'll help detect malicious requests. But I can't say that it's been without consequence. It does create very complex HT access files to reject certain users. There's also next time. There's also a service called WordFence that is a third-party tool. So I definitely recommend those. And I wanted to show.
Oh, yes. What else are you doing with WordPress, Martin?
I wanted to show. This is a WordPress implementation that's not a website in the traditional sense. It's a web app that we use in Santa Cruz to scan membership cards, and we import from Razor's Edge. We export from Razor's Edge a spreadsheet of membership, all the members and their cards. We use a program or a plugin called WP All Import. It lets us map our spreadsheet to fields within WordPress, and we create entries for each of the membership cards. When people come, the cards are scanned. QR code on the card is scanned. It pulls up a page like this, and it will tell it'll tell the door person whether their membership is in good standing, and it will allow them to check in. And this check-in button is Gravity Forms under the hood. Gravity Forms will create a CSV file that can be exported and fed back into the CRM and Razor's Edge. So that is what I wanted to show. And I'd like to answer your questions if you have any.
So we just redid our site in WordPress, and the Cold Fusion coders figured out WordPress to a point. But we get to the edges, and we want to get images out of the dam, or go over the ticketing system. They've got APIs out there, and they've got WordPress, and I'm not sure what to do with that in between.
Right.
Do I have to have them create a plugin? I pay somebody to do that? How do I?
Well, one thing that's really on the horizon for WordPress in a big way is a REST API. So it's really very close, and the direction for WordPress is to really transform it into a application platform, and I think you're going to see more and more implementations where the dashboard is completely replaced by custom creations, and that's what I would look into. I think right now it's a plugin. They're doing new features now as plugins, and then when they feel that they're really solid and ready to go out to 25% of the web, then they integrate them into core. But the WordPress REST API is a plugin that's available now and works, and so that's the direction I would go.
You should have everyone put a mic on the stuff to record.
Oh, that's my bad.
Or repeat the question.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat that question?
I just went to the
Or
next.
here, I'll run.
Too late.
I'll run.
Okay.
I am confused. It's you, right? Okay.
So this is more of a observation than a question, but there is a question in here. Is two radically different approaches to managing your information, from the simple text files with, it's going to last forever, to what is really a very, very complicated CMS, not because itself is complicated, but the plugin library is so huge to do that. So what's the pros and cons between the two?
Can I say that we encountered your case study this year with with the MCA Chicago. I should say they've got a new site coming out in a couple of days, and it's great. And the people are here, the developers are here, and you should ask them about it. But not everything was going to move over to their new site. They had, well, because everything would have to be rebuilt in the new architecture, and we had the 80s show microsite, and it was this massive microsite built within a CMS that was going to be deprecated, that was going to be phased out, and we ended up using SiteSucker, like a not totally reputable program, to like to skim the whole, bring the whole site down, convert it to static files, because that's how it would exist. That's, you know, that's how we could continue to have that.
Yeah.
So I mean, you'll probably say this, Eric, but I think it just depends on your project and the ultimate goals of your project. In some cases, having something like what we're doing with WordPress is more appropriate, and in some cases, doing something like what Eric and Greg are doing is more appropriate.
Yeah, I think one key thing is like, how often is the content that you're working with actually going to change? If it's going to change, you know, somewhat frequently, then yeah, it probably needs to have that built in. But for a book, often we actually don't want change. We want it to exist the way the author intended it to, unless we release a new edition.
And you want it citable, right?
Yeah, and citation really drives a lot of this. Scholars are hesitant to adopt digital publishing, and so we want to say, look, this is not going to change. It's going to be here in perpetuity.
And by the way, in Denver, we call that a crossover question. Both panels, so good job there.
Hi, I'm with a digital agency, and we are now using WordPress a lot, but we used to only use Drupal because WordPress didn't provide the tools that we needed. And we're loving WordPress now. And in the beginning of the project, we look at the requirements and we decide WordPress or Drupal. And I was wondering what you guys have seen as the critical decision points where WordPress maybe isn't sufficient.
I was going to say that the Drupal folks were going to have a rumble later at the drinking bout.
I'll start talking.
Sure, yeah, because you're a better representative of the business case.
Well, so in addition to the MCA and the Clifford Still, I've done a number of projects or consulted, not necessarily in redesigns, but in analyzing current systems and making recommendations for what people should go to. And I have found in a lot of cases that WordPress tends to be better for smaller institutions that don't have anyone technical on staff, because the institution is ultimately responsible for the content, and the content providers need to be able to use the system easily and effectively, efficiently. I think that was probably one of the big arguments that the Cooper Hewitt ran into when they had a Drupal-based site and they decided to get rid of it and go to WordPress. So that would be my comment.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
How are you guys, or anyone else in the room who is using WordPress, organizing your media libraries? Would you pop open the hood and let us take a look?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that we are. So in WordPress, well, you know, I used to. Okay, so in WordPress, you can upload directly to the media library, or if you're editing a post or a page, and you upload from there, you hit the Add Media button. It will associate that image with that post page. And early on, I used to use that a lot. Like I would say, you know, give me all of the images that are attached to this page or post, you know, and that was sort of a driving principle. You know, make galleries but that was really not intuitive to the content editors, I found. So now I much more use Advanced Custom Fields has a gallery field type, and it will let you select anything from the media library. Tell you, all I ever do, upload stuff and then search for it using the search. There are plugins that provide tagging within the media library, and reassignment from attachment from one to another. but I don't myself use them very much. But no. Mhm.
Do you have a naming scheme?
Well, and this is, I guess, maybe a content question.
Content, yeah.
Do you have a naming scheme?
Yes, we keep the name of the original file so that we can refine it. Well, the Clifford still, it's spread across the responsibility is spread across the organization, and so we really do use the original file name so that we can go back and find that file in the servers. But
Can I say Clifford Still is fantastic because his paintings are all like numbers. They're like these really. They don't even have names, right?
Yeah,
Like
they're all numbers, and it's actually fantastic for a whole lot more reasons than just that. But yeah, I don't really have a great answer for that.
Can I say something about images that I didn't really talk about before? When you're making your theme, you can define image sizes that when you upload an image, it will make the crops for you of those various sizes. And then there's a plugin that will let you, when you add a new crop, go back and reprocess the image. And I use that very often, especially during development. And this is also really handy for if you're using src set to do responsive, and you want to serve different image sizes to different devices. It will make all of your crops for you, and it'll make all these different sizes. And if you are doing that, I have some a little bit of a library that I wrote to help do src set in WordPress, and I would share it to anybody who is doing that.
So can I just make a comment to that? I think where the question's coming from is, in essence, these CMSs essentially create a flat directory of images, and it gets almost impossible to find that damn image. And so I also work for a digital agency, and we have customers who just re-upload the same image again because it was too hard for them to find it. So now we've got 3 copies of the same image, 4 copies of the same image, and the problem gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And we've tried, say, use a naming scheme, and they get it. The first people who do it get it, but unfortunately it falls down. And so I now actually have written a program that literally goes through and finds the duplicates, and I have to go back into the underlying CMS and essentially edit, replace. It's a real pain.
You know what I would? What I might do if we had a thing in the MCA site, we called them snippets. Am I in the right site? Snippets. And this was for text. This was a custom post type that we made, and these snippets don't themselves resolve to posts. You can't view them on their own, but it's meant for reusable bits of content that you would want. And I could see if this was something that was a concern in the project, you could create a custom post type that was images that got reused often, and then reference those rather than referencing the image directly.
Just at the end of our time, Eric shared his slides and also the demo that we didn't get to see. So
yeah, check it out or
Twitter
find me.
handle?
Oh yeah, EC Gardner. EC Gardner on Twitter. You can find the material there, and bug me in the hallway if you want to see the live thing, and I'll show you.
Sarah and Marty, maybe you'll do the same.
Yeah.
Awesome.
We want to shamelessly plug a project that we're working on right now. Marty and I are launching a national visitor motivation survey on. So far, we have about 12 museums signed up for it, which was already exceeded our goal, but we wanted to put it out to the community. Anybody who wanted to join us with this. It's a 1-question survey that you put on your website, and we track the responses in Google Analytics using custom variables, much like the Minneapolis Museum of Art has done, and we're just ripping them off. And then we're also ripping off John Falk's research on visitor motivation and identity, and that's how we framed the questions to try to kind of bridge the gap between what's happening, what the research has been for on-site visitation, and apply that for online visitation. So if you want more information about that, talk to one of us.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Thanks.
That was a great conversation.